Hello everyone, I'm Stephanie Riemer. I'm group leader of the Companion Animal Behavior Group at the University of Bern. And I'm very excited to present you a little study today which we performed in order to disentangle whether looking back in an unsolvable task in dogs reflects help seeking or rather giving up, which has recently been controversially discussed in the scientific literature. So in 2003, Miklos et al. Published a seminal study in which they introduced for the first time a so-called unsolvable task, such as you can see here, a cage where a reward was enclosed and could initially be pulled out by a string. This was rendered impossible by fixing the string to the cage, and the researchers compared the behavior of highly socialized hen-raised wolves and young dogs of the same age. And basically what they found was that wolves' behavior looked something like this. They would pretty much try to solve the problem independently and rarely gaze back at the person who was standing nearby. In contrast, in dogs, often it looks like this. Miklos et al. Concluded from their findings that dogs' readiness to gaze at humans' faces constitutes a key difference between dogs and wolves. Since then, many more studies have been conducted using the unsolvable task paradigm. Typically, looking back was interpreted as asking humans for help. However, more recently, some studies have questioned this assumption. For example, Marshall-Persini et al. Found that looking back is strongly related to persistence, and animals that are less persistent will look back sooner at the person, and this was regardless of species, including socialized wolves, pack-raised dogs, pet dogs, and free-ranging dogs. So wolves were more persistent on average than dogs, so this might actually explain why they showed less looking back. Also, Smith and Litchfield cautioned that referential looking might be overestimated using Miklos et al.'s definition, which was rather broad, that the head or nose of the animal was oriented towards any part of the caretaker. They suggested that limiting gazes to the person's face would be more likely to actually capture looking that's referential as opposed to random looking around or other reasons for looking. Last year, a study came out asking whether looking back behavior may be overinterpreted. Lazzaroni et al. Wondered whether dogs also should looking back at any other big but non-social objects, because they tested both pet dogs and free-roaming dogs with either a real human, no human at all, a dummy human, as you see on the left-hand picture, or a large non-human object that doesn't bear any resemblance with humans. They found that pet dogs look longer and more frequently at a human than a dummy human or object. They also look longer at humans than free-roaming dogs, which in my interpretation would both point to looking at the humans being a social communicative behavior. However, persistence and latency to looking back did not differ between pet dogs and free-ranging dogs, nor did they differ between conditions, presence or absence of a human or an object. Dogs were equally persistent when a human was present or absent. Based on this last point, Lazzaroni et al. Concluded that looking back does not constitute a social help-seeking strategy. In contrast, a number of other studies do support the notion that dogs' human-directed gazing in the unsolvable task is a social communicative behavior. There are some indicators which we can use to infer whether gazing might be communicative. These include audience effects, So dogs adjust looking behavior dependent on the presence of an audience, but also their attentive state. They may show attention-getting behaviors such as barking, and they may elaborate such behaviors when the recipient fails to respond. All of these behaviors have been observed in dogs in relation to an unattainable food reward, but no study so far has enabled a clear differentiation of dogs looking back because they want to request help, or dogs looking back because they just give up, so they are very attracted to looking at humans' faces. We used a novel paradigm in which an alternative reward was available while one reward type was enclosed in the box. In this case, you see a screenshot, and the left box, which you see, is so to say our unsolvable task, and the dog's toy was enclosed in that box. Meanwhile, on the right-hand side, you see a food puzzle, and food was available to the dog while the other reward type was unavailable. We performed the study both with food and toys. So at one point the food puzzle was enclosed in the box and the toy was available. At other times the toy was enclosed in the box and the food puzzle was available. So that way we catered both for highly food motivated dogs and for highly toy motivated dogs. And why is this such a critical step to have this alternative available? So here we aim to differentiate human-directed gazing due to giving up from gazing as a social problem-solving strategy. We could generate two alternative predictions since our dogs have the opportunity to interact with the alternative reward while one reward type is unavailable. If gazing constitutes a social problem-solving strategy, then we would predict that dogs that are more motivated for the inaccessible reward inside the box than for the available reward spend more time interacting with the box as well as more time gazing at people. So we would expect a positive association between interaction with the box, i.e. persistence, and human-directed gazing. In contrast, if gazing occurs as a consequence of giving up, then we would expect a negative association between interaction with the box and gazing. Our second objective was to assess the effect of different roles by the present people on dogs' gazing behavior. We had an owner and a stranger, so the experimenter present during the experiments. And we also varied whether it was the owner's role or the stranger's role to render the reward inaccessible. Again, we can generate several alternative predictions. If dogs just look at any salient large object nearby, as Lazarone et al. Suggested, then they should gaze equally at the two people present. If dogs primarily form an association with the reward and the person handling the reward, they should gaze longer at whoever was responsible for rendering the reward inaccessible. If dogs are primarily influenced by differential previous experiences or the social relationships with the present persons, we would expect them to gaze longer at the owner compared to the experimenter. All dogs participated in two subtests, a toy and box subtest and a food and box subtest. Here you again see a photo of the setup. The other reward was always freely available, while one reward type was enclosed in the box. Each condition lasted 3 minutes, which is longer than most studies who usually use just 1 minute long experiments. And this is relevant because if animals are very persistent, they might never reach the stage where they would be interested in looking back at a person. Also, unlike most other studies, there was no solvable condition, which prevented basically operant conditioning that certain manipulative behaviors would be reinforced during pre-training. Also, quite important, our dependent measure of interest was the dogs gazing into people's faces and not just gazing in the direction of any body part. Our 56 subjects were designated to two groups. The experimental responsible group, 29 dogs, where it was the stranger's role to handle the rewards and to render them inaccessible in the box. In contrast, the 27 dogs of the owner responsible group observed their owner handling the rewards and rendering them inaccessible. All videos were coded in Solomon Coder. We coded duration of gazing at the owner's face and the experimenter's face, duration of interacting with the box, which is believed to indicate persistence, duration of interacting with the toy when it was available, which tells us something about toy motivation, duration of interacting with the food puzzle when it was available, and the frequency of gaze alternations within 2 seconds. This is also called referential lookings, if animals look at the problem and then the owner, or the owner and then the box, or the same with the experimenter. And gaze alternations are also believed to be a sign of social communication. Interrate reliability was very good for all the variables, and we performed non-parametric statistics due to the non-normal distribution of the data. And here a little example of what that videos might look like. I chose this video because the dog shows many communicative behaviors, so a lot of these gaze alternations and even barking, which is also believed to be communicative. But what are the results? Firstly, I want to present you the correlation between persistence and human-directed gazing. In that case, we added up all gazing towards any person, both the owner and the experimenter. For the toy and box subtest, if we analyzed all 3 minutes of the subtest, there was a negative correlation, as was also found in previous studies. However, we only had 5 pieces of food in our food puzzle, so at some point the food puzzle would be empty. So therefore we repeated the analysis, but only included the time as long as food was still available. So only as long as the dogs had an alternative. And that's the correlation in that case. The correlation was highly significantly positive, and the correlation coefficient was even higher than it was before. So, as long as an alternative is available, the correlation between persistence and gazing is positive. This is the same analysis for the food and box subtest. And unlike with the toy and box subtest, there was an alternative available throughout because the toy could not be consumed. And here you see again a highly significant positive relationship between duration of interaction with the box and duration of box-related gazing at persons. You see 2 lines here. The solid line indicates the correlation including the 3 outliers on the right-hand side of the x-axis. The dashed line is the correlation without these 3 outliers, but the statistics were done on the full sample, so this was just added for visualization purposes. So as in the toy box subtest, as long as an alternative is available, the correlation between persistence and gazing is positive. So, there's a positive association between persistence and gazing when an alternative is available. This means both interaction with the task and gazing appear to reflect motivation to obtain the inaccessible reward, which would suggest that in this case, looking at people is mostly referential and constitutes an alternative problem-solving strategy, trying to get the owner or the experimenter to help them. However, when we analyzed all 3 minutes of the toy and box subtest, where at some point there was no alternative available anymore, this negative association between persistence and gazing indicates that looking back probably also reflects giving up at some point. So our next point of interest was the responsibility of the owner versus the experimenter. And first we calculated whether there were some a priori differences between the treatment groups, such as how persistent they were in the two subtests, how long they interacted with the food puzzle during the toy and box subtest, and how long they interacting with the toy during the food and box subtest. These analyses showed that there were no a priori motivational differences between the groups. All of these comparisons were not significant. But what about direction of gaze in the two groups? Here you see the data for the toy and box subtest, and you see that if the owner was responsible on the left side, then over 90% of gazes were directed at the owner, while just under half of the gazes were directed at the stranger if the stranger was responsible. So this was a highly significant difference. So if the dogs would randomly gaze at either person, we would expect them to be at about 50% in both cases. But we find a great preference for the owner in the owner responsible group and no particular preference for either person in the stranger responsible group. And here I want to introduce another important distinction, namely box-related gazing versus toy-related gazing. Since we had a toy available in the food and box subtest, we couldn't be sure that all the gazing would actually be in relation to the unsolvable problem. So based on what the dog was doing before or after gazing at the person, we differentiated box-related gazing, which was coded if the dog was interacting or looking at the box prior or after gazing at the person. In contrast, toy-related gazing was coded when the dog had the toy between his paws and when he was looking or interacting with the toy before or after looking at the person. And this distinction is really important, as you will see in a moment. So here you see the results for box-related gazing. So this is in relation to the unsolvable task. And you see here that again, in the owner responsible group, the dogs almost exclusively looked at the owner. In the experiment responsible group, they looked less at the owner and more at the stranger, but still primarily they did prefer to look at the owner. Here you see the result for toy-related gazing, and here the picture is quite different. When the owner was responsible, again, they almost exclusively look at the owner. However, when the stranger was responsible, they spent more time looking at the stranger, which is quite unlike for box-related gazing. Finally, I want to present the results for gaze alternations. Here the purple color refers to gaze alternations involving the owner, and the turquoise color are gaze alternations involving the experimenter. There was a highly significant difference in the number of gaze alternations involving the experimenter, as you can also see in the graph. This was the case for both the food in box and the toy in box subtest. What I've presented here is the toy in box subtest. In contrast, in neither subtest was there a difference in gaze alternations involving the owner. So, what to make of these findings? Well, we were able to control for motivation by allowing dogs access to a different reward type, either food or toy, while the respective other reward type was enclosed in the box. We found that as long as an alternative reward was available, duration of interaction with the box and box-related gazing were highly positively correlated, which indicates that looking back constitutes an alternative social problem-solving strategy. Another interesting finding was that dogs adjust gazing depending on the one hand on the different people's responsibility, but also on their current goal. So in the unsolvable task, when it comes to box-related gazing, dogs prefer gazing at the owner, even when the experimenter was responsible, although they do show increased gazing at the experimenter approximately 1/3 of the time when the experimenter was responsible. When it comes to toy-related gazing, dogs in the owner-responsible group almost exclusively gaze at the owner. Conversely, dogs in the experimenter-responsible group gaze longer at the experimenter. Thus, gaze direction cannot be explained by direct associations with the person handling the reward, because otherwise we wouldn't have found differences based on whether the dogs wanted to play with the toy or whether they wanted to access the reward in the box. It also can't be explained by differences in visual salience between the people, since it was changing again depending on the individual dog's current goal or motivation. When the owner was responsible, 92% of box-related gazes and 96% of toy-related gazes were directed to the owner. When the experimenter was responsible, 71% of box-related gazing was directed at the owner, but 69% of toy-related gazing was directed at the experimenter. Thus, neither short-term experiences during the behavior test nor long-term experiences during everyday life can account for these differential results regarding box-related and toy-related gazing. Dogs seem to preferably gaze towards the owner when in need of help, but to direct play invitations to the person who had last handled their reward. Possibly, turning to the caregiver in times of need may reflect the attachment relationship, similar as was also demonstrated in relation to potentially fear-evoking stimuli. Also, the higher toy-related gazing at the experimenter in the experimental responsible group could be in line with the secure base effect. Since the owner was present throughout, the dogs might be confident enough to try to engage the stranger in play. And this was in case of the experimental responsible group, the person who had last handled the toy. So he might or she might be more likely to interact with the dog in that context. To conclude, our results give several lines of evidence for the communicative function of looking back. Firstly, dogs that were more motivated for the reward inside the box than for the available reward showed higher persistence and longer gazing as long as an alternative was available. They are sensitive to the people's roles and they adjust gazing behavior depending on who was responsible for handling the rewards. And they also show gaze alternations, a hallmark of communication. And again, the gaze alternations were affected by who was responsible. Nonetheless, not all looking back is referential, and sometimes looking back may just indicate giving up as well, or boredom, or maybe other types of attention seeking. With this, I want to thank you very much for your attention. I thank all the dog owner teams who participated in the study, and also many thanks to the organizers of the conference for all their efforts.